welcome to today's webinar, The New Nonprofit Normal. I am Lindsay Moen, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the co-founder of Prosper Strategies. We are a strategic advisory firm based in Chicago, and we work exclusively with the nonprofit sector on strategic planning, marketing and communications, fundraising, team optimization, and measurement. Thank you all so much for being here on this inauguration day. And welcome to our panelists, hi, who are here and have generously agreed to share their time with us today. I am going to let each one of them introduce themselves to you here today, starting with Charles.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Charles Montorio Archer, the President and CEO at One Hope United. My pronouns are he, his, and him.
Great. Edward.
Edward, Chief Officer of External Relations at the AIDS Foundation Chicago, pronouns he, him, his.
And Jeremy.
Jeremy Foster, CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Metropolitan Chicago. Happy Inauguration Day. Hopefully many of you got a chance to watch that and felt the gravity of that. And my pronouns are he, him, his.
Wonderful. So happy to have the three of you here today to share your perspectives on what's an exciting day, as well as what we hope will be an exciting and positive year ahead. Before we dive into the meat of today's webinar, just want to cover off on a few logistics for everyone. So first off, yes, this webinar will be recorded. It will be emailed. Don't worry about taking notes. Just relax, enjoy the conversation. We'll also email these slides here to everyone. Second, we plan to leave quite a bit of time for questions today. We really want to touch on the things that you all are here to learn. So please use the chat box to ask your questions. You can find that on usually the top or the bottom of your screen. And when you click on it, your chat window will open. You have the option to send your questions to everyone or just to the panelists. So when we get to the Q&A, we'll really try to get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. Before we dive in here, I want to just give you all a little bit of a roadmap in terms of where we're going today. So here is our plan. I am going to start by introducing you to a new sector initiative that we're spearheading here at Prosper Strategies in collaboration with nonprofit leaders. It's called the Nonprofit Impact Pledge. And then Charles, Edward, and Jeremy are going to really explore the trends that they see shaping the new nonprofit normal in 2021 and beyond. So finally, as I said, we are going to open up the floor to your questions. So please, throughout this discussion, make note, put them in the chat box. Really, really want to use this time to answer those questions for you. All right, so without further ado, as I said, I want to start by introducing all of you to the Nonprofit Impact Pledge. You can read it and learn more about it at nonprofitimpactpledge.com. It's really consistent with the theme of today's webinar. Many of the nonprofit leaders we work with, we talk to regularly, are just recognizing that they don't wish for things to return to normal following COVID, the widespread racial unrest, and everything that has ensued in 2020, and now, unfortunately, the beginning of 2021. So we really wanted to take time to explore what does a new normal look like for the sector. So check that out at nonprofitimpactpledge.com. It was put together, just so you're all aware, along with around 30 sector leaders and it includes 10 commitments that nonprofits can take to move toward a new normal that results in positive changes for the good of all. So there's also a pledge for donors and funders. It has its own set of commitments. You can see some of the organizations who've already joined and are taking the pledge on your screen. So visit nonprofitimpactpledge.com and you can either sign on as an individual or an organization. And then starting today with this conversation, we are going to spend the next year really delving into each one of these commitments and discussing the actionable ways that we can turn them from statements to really a reality for the communities that we exist to serve. So look forward to having you all check that out, sign it. And with that, we are going to dive in to the conversation today. My first question for our panelists is, how do you think that the events of 2020 are going to shape our work in the sector moving forward? And I'm going to start off with Edward.
Thanks, Lindsay. And thank you again for having me on the webinar today. I think one of the biggest things that happened, if not the biggest thing in 2020, was the revealing. This is something many of us already knew, but really the revealing of the racist systems that permeate the United States. And all systems pretty much within our country are impacted by racism. And we saw that in a big way through police brutality, the police murders. We also saw that through COVID. Within the HIV sector, we've known for quite some time that certain communities, particularly Black and Latinx communities, are disproportionately impacted by HIV because of a lack of healthcare access, because of racism, because of homophobia, transphobia, among many other sort of environmental factors. And I think that because of how COVID impacted certain communities, which was, kind of predictable based on how our systems are set up, that it really revealed that in a big way, just how much racism affects our country. And the question is, how will that shape our work moving forward? And I know we're going to talk more about racial equity further into the presentation, but my hope is that nonprofits throughout the country, throughout the world, companies, individuals, all start to understand the role that racism plays within these systems, and puts that front and center and works to fix that and alleviate this issue within our country and throughout the world.
Yes, and we will talk about what each one of your organizations is doing to continue to center racial justice. But before we do, Jeremy, would love to hear your perspective on this question.
Yeah, I think what the events have done is it gets you to think of all of the issues that your beneficiaries of your mission are dealing with. So I know we get so focused on this is our mission, this is what we're doing, but boy, we were smacked in the face with, they're also dealing with, of course, the racial injustice, systemic racism, all the things that we've seen, the health disparity, right? When you see how this has impacted folks. So then it forces you to think, what should we be doing to support those things that are outside the core mission? Like, we always need to stay true to who we are, but I think it starts to inform who else we need to be working with so that we're all working together to impact these things, right? And so, because that's what this has done for us, at least at Big Brothers Big Sisters, is we're so focused on creating and supporting these mentoring relationships. And we've always known there's the other challenges out there, but it shed such an immense and intense light on these things, where I think it really forced us to dive deep into these and say, what are you doing about it to support those that you serve?
And Jeremy, what are some of the areas you're exploring or the questions that you're asking yourselves there at Big Brothers Big Sisters?
Relationship with police. I know some of these are going to weave in and out. We've had a long-standing program with police, and it took one moment in the summer that completely threw that in disarray. And we had parents reaching out to us big brothers and big sisters, the littles, and now, you know, we had to have this deep dialogue on what are we doing in relationship with our police partners as they are serving as big brothers and big sisters. So, you know, it forced you to kind of jump into that, I'd say racial justice work even deeper than what you were before, because now you really are seeing, like I said, you knew it was there, but it was put for the world to see in front of us. And then all the emotions and everything that our constituencies and stakeholders were dealing with, it just got pushed to the forefront. So there for a while, it was less about, you know, the mentoring relationships and more about what are we doing, because we serve so many children of color. What are we doing now? And in some ways, kind of demanding us to take these types of things head on.
Yeah, and you mentioned something else that I've heard a lot from sector leaders, which is a newfound sort of appreciation or urgency for the services that are provided by so many nonprofits. It's so much easier in many ways to make the case for why what we do is needed. And I'm sure, Charles, you can probably talk about that a little bit in your answer to this question, but would love to hear your perspectives. Let me just unmute you. Or maybe you can, there you go.
I am muted. Okay, good. I thank you, Lindsay. I definitely agree with both Edward and Jeremy about what, you know, we've been pushed forward to. But I've been thinking about this from this perspective of the social determinants of health, which is kind of the underlining thing that we know that our communities need. And without any one of those things, the communities fall apart. And when you think about the double pandemic of last year, COVID and race, it really pushed us towards the lack of those services and supports and communities that we some of us always knew were there, but it just puts us in a position that we were confronted with it in a way that we could not avoid it. And for One Hope United, and definitely for my leadership and my leadership team at the organization, we started to read in general about how we could be better stewards of our mission. And there are 3 books that we read that stood out, and I'll just mention them. So we read The 4 Disciplines of Execution, we read Crucial Conversations, and we read Essentialism. And the reason why those 3 books became really important for our leadership in 2020 is because we started to ask ourselves, are we spending time on the things that really move our mission forward? And that was the test for us in 2020. We've always believed that what we do benefits the family, but is it in furtherance of the actual vision for society that we see with the people that we see it with? And I think that's what that whole double pandemic year really did for me and One Hope, push us closer to saying, we want to do these 3 things over the next 3 years. Everything else is in partnership, but our mission will be aligned with these things.
And I think that's a really good segue into our next question here. You know, we're touching on this in this conversation. What are each of your organizations doing to continue to center racial justice? And Charles, as you just alluded to, how are you engaging the communities that you serve in shaping your priorities? And Charles, we'll stick with you here.
You know, it's a very interesting question. I think, Lindsay, you know, I'm very glad to be here, but your questions are very extremely thought-provoking. And what, you know, I'm very much an introspective person. And I think at One Hope, we're going through our own introspection. I think that there are things that we will definitely do with the community externally, but we've got to kind of get ourselves in a better position around this discussion around anti-racism or just systemic and structural, you know, systems of care that we want to kind of, you know, dilute or break down. But what we've decided to do was to start a task force on equity in human services. During the George Floyd, you know, murder or whatever you would like to call it, the reality is that my staff, you know, for the first time in my career of 30 years, pushed me to make a decision around what was our position on race. Not that we didn't have it as an organization, not that I didn't have it as an individual, but it really pushed us towards what are we going to do and how are we going to change it. So the task force on equity and human services is really one, looking internally at our practices within the organization that maybe silently or deliberately feed into the structures that we, you know, that we actually operate in. We're looking at the systems of care that we touch to ensure that we're pushing an agenda that also supports racial justice and systemic support. And then the third thing is to really look at how we might want to partner with other community organizations and leaders in order to fulfill this work. Because we are a child welfare organization that is affected by healthcare, that is affected by criminal justice, that is affected by homelessness. It might not be our mission, but it's really important for us in this work to be aligned with those institutions or organizations that support that type of initiatives.
Great. Yeah. So you're really focused on the work starts from within, and then you'll start reaching out into the community. Now, Charles, we've had several people ask you to just mention the names of those 3 books. Again, I will type them in the chat too, but if you wouldn't mind just naming those out for us again.
It was Crucial Conversations by Patterson. It was 4 Disciplines of Execution by Covey, and Essentialism by McCowan, I think his name is.
Great. Yeah. Very helpful. Okay,
and
Edward.
I could just jump in here, Charlie. That essential, if nothing else, that essentialism book, that will bring immense clarity, not only to you as a leader, your entire team. And I think I did put a link in there to the Amazon deal. That just changes a lot for
absolutely.
Wonderful. All right, Edward, would love to hear your perspective here. Oh, you're on mute.
Unmuted. One of those books is on my shelf right here. I was going to try to reach up and get it, but it would be too awkward, so I'm not going to do that. In terms of what our organization is going to be doing in the next year around racial justice, I think is continue to really focus inward, as we were talking about before. We started this journey, a while back, and have done many steps. Since then, we did an Undoing Racism training workshop with staff, which is a 2.5-day workshop. I highly recommend it. It was extremely moving and beneficial for our staff. We've done unconscious bias trainings, some other trainings and workshops, book readings around different issues relevant to racial justice. But we realized that though we've done all this, we still have a long way to go. We need to continue on this journey and stay really focused. So for our next phase, we brought on the Morden Group. Mary Morden, I don't know if you all know her, Mary, she's amazing, Chicagoan, does great work in this area, to do a staff assessment, which we actually just had completed a few weeks ago, and on Tuesday at our staff meeting, gave the results to our entire 130 member staff to ask questions and to provide input on what we learned, just because we need to know where we are now in order to make improvements. So from there, we'll have our stakeholders, our staff, come together with various committees. We have a Race and Social Justice Committee that we launched a few years ago that will take this work to the next level. We'll come up with priorities. And I would say that one of the major communities that we're engaging in shaping this particular priority is our staff, our amazing 130-person staff. These are brilliant people who work directly with community, who are on the ground, who know how to move these forward. So we're getting their input. They're going to be a fundamental part of it. We're also getting our board of directors input, of course, and we've been really striving to make our board as diverse as possible. We're now at 50% people of color on our board, but we still have more progress to make in that area and are going to strive over the next year to continue to diversify our board. So that's kind of the inward work and the inward looking work. In terms of our external work, we have a capacity building program, and I saw someone put in the chat, one way to create change is by funding grassroots organizations. So our capacity building work works with smaller community organizations. At this point, all of those organizations are led by Black individuals. So really prioritizing providing capacity building growing that program, providing more support for those organizations that are on the ground working in the community is going to be a fundamental goal of ours. And of course, we'll get those organizations' inputs. They'll be part of that process. Secondly, we're going to be launching or continuing to implement rather our Getting to Zero Illinois initiative, which is essentially going to end the HIV epidemic by 2030 in Illinois. We can do this. We have a plan in place, but the way we put that plan in place is one, we knew needed to be rooted in racial equity and community input. So we went across the state. We did town halls in pretty much every part of the state, gathered feedback on the plan. I mean, there's so much feedback, but because of that, we now have this plan that is an amazing combination of government, of community, of the private sector, as well as the nonprofit world. And I think that balance is something that is making this plan feel really good as we implement it and making us feel like, yeah, we're making the right decisions here. This is not AFC's plan, this is the community's plan, and they came up with it through their input and that process. So those are a few areas. This is really broad. I mean, racism is a public health issue, and it affects every aspect of our work. So I think the last thing I'll say is that looking at our next strategic plan, making sure that racial justice is embedded in that strategic plan, and we're going to be working on that over the next year.
Really great perspective. Thanks so much for sharing, Edward. Jeremy, what do you have going on?
Yeah, the first thing I think what we all have to just kind of take a breath and understand is there's so many words, that these bigger words, complex words thrown out there, right? You have systemic racism, you have racial justice, you have racial equity. They all impact and are part of each other, but they're different. So the one thing that we've just remained committed to is you really got to dive deep into each one and understand what they are first and foremost. And then you put that into context of who you're serving and how that impacts your stakeholders. And that will start informing you of what you need to do to continue this work. So that's one thing and there's no, I will tell you, is because I'm a very pragmatic person and I'm always like, what's the playbook, right? I want a playbook so I can go execute it. There is no playbook here, right? There isn't something you can just pick up or go to. And I'll tell you, if you want an exercise and you're going to need an adult beverage afterwards, just go start researching some of these topics. You're going to have so many consultancies out there now that are, and there's so many different approaches in that. That's my point of learn what these topics are, first and foremost for yourself, explore them with your team in context of your mission and who you're serving, and then involve those you serve in that process. And it's a marathon, not a sprint. You got to be patient through here. Like I said, because there is no roadmap here, right? It's just this commitment to, you're always going to be in a state of the WIP, work in progress. It's always going to be a work in progress because we're dealing with human beings and pretty complex issues. So that's the piece that we have just gone through. And, this has not been a knee-jerk reaction to what's happened in the world, but we started this journey, going on 4 years ago, and really first, as I think, my partners had said, is looking internally. What are your own policies, procedures, the way you talk about your mission, right? First and foremost, amongst your staff, amongst your stakeholders, though you're trying to reach. I'll give you one example. We've struggled historically with recruiting men of color, particularly African-American men, because and the reason we have an intentionality around there is most of the children on our wait list are boys and boys of color. And when we started involving more men of color in the work, saying, what are we not doing at Big Brothers Big Sisters to attract more men of color? It said, well, one of the things is just the language you're using around background checks. And now you're well-intended. We know what you're saying is you're committed to the safety and well-being of children. But when you say background checks, you keep leading with that, you're almost missing the inequity in the criminal justice system of understanding, especially in a city like Chicago, that if you're a black man in particular living on the southwest sides of Chicago, chances are, because of our system, there's probably something colorful in the background. And if we don't address that up front, this is part of the reason why you're not going to get a lot of men of color coming through, because right off the bat, you're going to deny me. And so that's the learning I'm talking about, is you've got to look at just deeply in your own policies and procedures, because you may look at it and be like, well, that's okay. But if you don't then involve those you're intending to bring into the mission, you're gonna miss the mark. So that's just one example I wanted to give you. We could go a week training on this, right? This topic, because it's so deep. It's a mile wide and a mile deep. And then again, how are you engaging communities you serve and shaping your priorities? One of the best things we did was start a family advisory council. You can imagine the topics we're taking on. I mentioned before our relationship with police, and I will tell you, it's a wide spectrum. We have some that are like, nope, I will pull my children out of the program. You can't have anything to do with police. And we have others that are like, nope, we have to stay at the table. We have to hold accountable. So it's working through that. And what I will tell you with that work is, we do have a chance to meet with our parent group and inform the police of what this is really like to our families, and listen to some of the moms who've already shared stories here, the relationships they've had. And so I think that's it. It's a marathon, not a sprint. There is no playbook. You just have to be committed to learning. And I will tell you, shockingly, one of the websites I went to, especially to dive deep into systemic racism, of all websites, Ben & Jerry's does a pretty damn good job of highlighting like 7 ways we know systemic racism is real. And I'll put that in there. It's just, it's something that you consume. It's understandable. So you can really start understanding what these terms mean.
If I could just add one thing, Lindsay,
Please.
because as Jeremy was speaking, the one thing that I've been doing, definitely with my team and definitely in my life personally, is making room for error or mistake, and then forgiving people when they do it. Because if we don't, Black and brown people, we don't always get it right as much as white and Asian people don't get it right either. And I think creating a space for people to be forgiven when they make an error is something that it has to be a part of this work, or we're always going to be at odds with each other.
Thank you for sharing that, Charles. I do want to encourage the audience to start getting your questions into the chat box now. We're going to cover one more question here together before getting to your questions. So with all of this, I want to ask each of the panelists, what do you think that nonprofit leaders should be doing today to prepare for success in 2021 and beyond? And Edward, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Just to, I think this harkens back to our discussion about racial equity. And I think, as nonprofit leaders, it's incredibly important for us to, understand these systems, understand how they work, and try to see clearly the racism that exists in our country. And that's a process. Like, I've been programmed for, about nearly 40 years of my life to see things in a certain way. So it has to be a really intentional effort through books, through workshops, through other things, to really be able to see clearly. And I think even at that point, when you're like, okay, I'm starting to see this clearly, you realize that you can't see it clearly because of how we've been forced to look at the world and our communities in a certain way for so long. So I think that's continues to be, one major component, and really is ongoing work. The other things I say are to, continue to understand how we can maximize virtual spaces for different initiatives, for fundraising, for example. We had a virtual gala this year, and it raised, I think, more money than our regular gala did 5 years ago. We didn't have the overhead of, and I think it's going to raise more in terms of the gross funds, we'll see, but I think it will be, but definitely with the net funds, because we did not have to pay for flowers. We did not have to rent a big ballroom. We didn't have to, pay entertainers to potentially come to town to do something. So we saved a lot of expenses by doing a virtual event. For our AIDS Run and Walk event, one of our biggest, most successful corporate fundraising teams was actually all over the country, not just in Chicago, because they were virtual participants. So we were then able to raise funds throughout the country for our Run Walk event, because it was a virtual event versus having an in-person event. So I would say finding that balance of how we can take what we learned in terms of doing virtual fundraising, virtual sort of philanthropy, and combining that with the tried and true practices of fundraising and moves management is going to be a really important thing to know about and to invest in moving forward.
Yeah, 2020 caught us all a bit off guard, and now 2021, we're ready and looking at, hopefully as the world starts to open back up, opportunities to continue to couple what we learned in 2020 from the virtual perspective with those in-person events again. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Jeremy, thoughts on what leaders can do now?
Yeah, I mean, listen, for how, uncertain 2020 was, and still 2021 is, there was a gift we were all given there too, is we have a license now to be as innovative and creative, more so than we ever have, right? And some of it was forced upon us, but I think our staff knows it, our board knows it, our donor community, our partners, that, it's like all bets are up. Like, do what you have to do to continue to be there for those you serve. And so one, that's the gift. So now it's, what do we do with that going into 2021? So the first piece is, you always have to be committed to managing for the short term and long term. Sometimes we get so mired in just the day to day, and I understand it, right? It's hand to mouth sometimes, but you do have to force yourself of, what does it look like right now to keep this going? But once things start getting back to somewhat normal, what do we look like as an organization there too? So, spend time in doing that with your leadership team. The other piece is, and I think Edward was, hinting on this when it comes to fundraising and what have you, is you have to stay in regular communication with all your stakeholders, especially your donors. It's not like they wake up and say, I wonder what Charles is doing today. I think I can support them at One Hope United. Same thing. I wonder what Edward's doing. What does he need from me today, right? Not how it works, folks. It's our job to stay in communication. And that's another thing I think that came out of this, was it forced us to communicate on a regular basis the impact of this mission, and connected our donors to what's happening in the world, right? And we are the connection for so many people saying, what the hell do I do right now? This is it. Get involved in our respective organizations, because we are boots on the ground that are impacting all these things that you're watching on TV. But it's up to us to keep in contact with our stakeholders, especially our donors, so they can feel a part of this as they move through, because they're seeing a bunch of, like Charles said, some of them might be feeling like they're being bashed on, right? And so this is why you've got to have this open communication, with your folks, to just let them understand that they're a part of positive change that's happening in each of our respective communities.
That's great. Great points. Charles, what do you have to add here?
I definitely agree with everything that was said, but for me, I've been looking at it in this way of kind of listening and scanning the environment, understanding that state budgets and donor philanthropic institutions are planning 5 years out, so we must be aware of those things. Service delivery systems are planning 3 to 5 years out. Stakeholders are thinking about what's important to them, and it really has to be a time where we listen and then scan to make sure that before we act, we have the data points and all the metrics in order to make informed decisions. Then I'll pick up on what Jeremy said around innovation. Innovation is great, but you also need to make sure your infrastructure supports the innovation that you want to see. Because it's one thing to go out there and innovate, but then you don't have the internal infrastructure to sustain that innovation, which I think is also important. I think when it comes down to mission movement and mission building work, it's also going to rely on quality and compliance. We must be good at providing services, period. If we're not good at providing services, then we should not be in this line of work. And that also requires a compliance component, which I think in order for us to stay in business, we understand that piece. And then I think the last thing that we've had to deal with last year in 2020, being that we were affected in one budget year and then had to plan for the next budget year, is being able to do better budget monitoring and modification when needed. Everything that made it in the budget might not need to be done right away. Some things might need to be scaled back in order to push other things forward. And I think within those 4 areas, we are really trying to decide what 2020 and 22, because we'll be entering fiscal year 22 in July, what are those 2 years going to look like, and what do we need to do in the planning of them?
Yeah, planning with so much uncertainty is really difficult. And you hit the nail on the head with those folks who have summer budgeting seasons. It was really difficult this year, and might continue to be so. So we are going to turn it over now to audience Q&A, and there are folks already putting questions into the chat box. So please add questions as they come. The first thing I'm seeing is a lot of questions around how you're thinking about virtual versus in-person events, and if you've done anything virtually that you've found particularly successful. And I kind of saw all of you nodding your heads when Edward was talking about the galas. Charles, I know you've done some virtual town halls. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've seen work there, and then we'll go down the line if any of the other panelists have things to add.
So we do the town halls, and we did an annual meeting with our staff, and we did it with the community. Nearly 1,000 people joined us. And I think the one thing is to ensure that it is professionally done. I know that, we like to think that our IT departments are like the best in the world, but our success, and like Edward, we raised more money than we ever raised in a virtual event that was only 45 minutes to 50 minutes. But I think the reality was it was such a professional event. I think people were able to engage and connect with it. We did a lot of pre-work and we did a lot of post-work with donors just to make sure people felt that, it was really good. That'd probably be the biggest thing. I also believe that moving forward in this calendar year, we will not do an in-person event. But when we do get back to in-person events, because of the scale and the volume of people who could support our mission, we will always do both a virtual and an in-person if we ever get back to that point, because we realize people want to support and be involved, but might not be able to sit in the room with you. And we need to be able to create that space, not just from fundraising, but I also think throughout the whole service system, there's going to be a hybrid of both of those things.
Great. Edward, anything to add? I know you already touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, it's been an incredibly complicated last 12 months for us at AFC, because we have 2 events. We have a gala that's only once every 5 years that happened to be this year. It was scheduled for May 16, 2020. Obviously, that did not happen on that day. We ended up pushing it back to November after many changes and iterations. Because when we first got the news, we're like, oh, well, in 8 weeks, we'll be able to do a gala, because no one imagined that. I at least did not imagine that we'd still be in this situation 10 months later. So that was an issue. We also have a World of Chocolate event, but in addition to that, we have our AIDS Run Walk, which not only supports AFC, but supports 20 plus community organizations in Chicago. So we had to figure out, how are we going to do an AIDS Run Walk in this environment? We also have a marathon team. We have Team to End AIDS. There was no marathon. So when you put all that into perspective, when it comes to both participants and funds raised, there was a lot up in the air. So we tried to go the virtual route for pretty much everything. We would have a little bit of hybrid here and there, where folks could use an app on their phone, do a run walk, do a marathon, that sort of thing. But I think what we learned, as I mentioned before, is that these virtual events, they work. To Charles's point, they have to be done well. We definitely had some technology hiccups throughout this process, and we forgave ourselves for those. But they work, and they are able to raise funds. Now, as we look forward, we continue to be in a precarious position, because will there be a marathon in October? You ask one person, they're like, absolutely not. You ask the next person, they're like, yeah, it's going to happen by then. Something's going to happen by then. So it's just an unknown. So I think for us, we have to plan for both. We're going to plan for both in-person and virtual events. And we will take it day by day. We will try to refer back to the playbook that we developed over the last year in our minds and through what we put on paper, but also realize that every day presents something different, and that being nimble and being innovative and empathetic and understanding each other is the best way to move forward.
Yeah, playbook in air quotes is right? We all sort of made it up this year. And part of me questions, were these things so successful because they were novel, right? Or is some of this going to wear off as we are all experiencing the fatigue of being on these technologies all day? Jeremy, do want to give you the opportunity to chime in if you have anything on this topic. We have a lot of other great questions too.
Yeah, I'll be quick. It really depends on your audience, right? And what their connection is to your mission, your organization. So I'll give you a quick example. 2 of our most successful events, it's because board members have been doing them for a long time. They reached out and said, hang in there with us, even though we can't do it. Highly successful. We didn't have all the expense. Of course, we did better there. Peer-to-peer, however, completely hammered, because there's a little bit more of a disconnect. So you have folks that are going out to friends and family, hey, throw $5, $25, I'm raising money, right? Those tended to not be as successful. So I think it's, audience, how close are they to your mission? And then to Charles, if it's run smoothly, quickly, people will appreciate that. And if they feel the mission in there, you'll be successful.
Yeah, we had I would say our peer-to-peer events, I think they're all going to hit goal, but they are definitely way down compared to last year. I mean, we probably had maybe a third, maybe a little bit more, almost half maybe of our run walk participants doing it virtually than we would have in person in a normal year. So a similar experience for us as well. And board leadership made such a difference, as Jeremy mentioned, in terms of fundraising during the last 9 months and keeping our gala successful despite everything.
Yeah. So with all that, there's a question here about, it's from an organization that is funded federally and at the state level. But I think all of us, no matter how we're funded, are thinking about how are we going to be diversifying revenue streams with all of this? And it's something we should be thinking about in this time and beyond. So curious how each of you is thinking about diversifying revenue streams. I think Jeremy might have something to say here.
We've all heard this, that if you're not doubling down on individual giving, right, you're way behind. And I will tell you, I've been in this for, like Charles, 30 years, right? And I've gone to all the AFP, everything, and they've been telling us for 30 years, you really got to double down. You absolutely have. We collectively have to do this, right? There is a playbook and roadmap out there for this. Look at how colleges, universities do it. And sometimes in our social sector, we say, well, it's because, it's the way they are. People have more of an experience, so they can relate to that. That's why. No, it's not. It's how they do it. It's relationship-based fundraising, inviting people in to be a part of your mission. And when they are a part of your mission and they get to experience it, chances are they will support you. But you have to have a system that does that and is committed to doing that. I will tell you that we were very much transactional. We grew our organization off of corporate partnerships where they signed an MOU, this many kids were served, this many employees. We tremendously grew the organization, but we trained everybody to be in this transactional kind of partnership with us, right? We now set our sights on transformationally growing our organization and brought in a firm that says we have to get into this relationship-based individual fundraising. That's changed the culture of our board, our staff, you name it. And, we're halfway there. We crossed the $4.5 million mark of a $9 million campaign to get there. And that's all 100% been in this commitment to relationship-based fundraising through individual giving. I will never go back. It's some of my most rewarding conversations when you get to sit down and talk about the mission in a deeply personal way. People will feel your passion and commitment for it, and then you can show them the impact. You have to do it. I know it's tough, and I'm committed. You can, I know, Lindsay, you'll probably share the information. Please reach out to me. I'm available to you to walk you through this and help with this, but we have to do this as a sector to keep our social services strong outside of governmental resources. I'm not saying you go away from it, but we have to start doing that. And that's the area of focus I would recommend.
I could add just one thing. I definitely, support, I think in general, everything's relationships. So you think about the philanthropic side of it and ensuring that you're building that individual relationship pool that in some ways, we've also taken an approach that we might be dealing with the parents in this relationship, but those children are also learning about philanthropy. And I want to build the lasting relationship beyond the parent as well. But for our organization, where we do have a great deal of support from the federal government, state, and local, it's also to be mindful that if you're going to think about diversifying in your service delivery, make sure it aligns with your mission. Because I think a lot of times we want to diversify and we want to grab everything humanly possible that we're just mediocre at. We're not great at it. We're good at it, but we might not be where we need to be. And we just have to be mindful that every opportunity should be explored, but might not be for you. And I constantly go back to this thing on this internal reflection, because I think that also has helped One Hope and I look at what our strategic goals will be in the future. We've also been mindful that an opportunity that comes today to go back to someone who's actually made it and say, we're not suited for it today, but in 6 months, can we come back to you and diversify at that moment? Because then now we know how to plan and prepare for this new opportunity. So diversification is great, but do it with the people you serve, the people who do the serving, and the mission in mind to ensure that it actually brings you this access to other people who need your support.
Great insight and addition. Edward, did you want to add anything here?
I think Charles and Jeremy covered this, and I am in complete agreement with everything they said and echo that sentiment.
Great. Okay, so someone here asks, what are the most impactful ways that we can support nonprofit leaders in this climate? And then I'm going to make this a two-parter. So what can we do to support you all? But also, what are you then doing to support your staff through this time and others involved in your organization? And how are you connecting folks and keeping them engaged in such a virtual environment? Edward, I'm going to start with you on this one.
So the last year has been, or 10 months or whatever, has been an interesting one, I would say, in terms of staff relationships, because, we're all living through a pandemic together. Like, we've gone through some serious stuff together. And when you experience that with your staff members, I do think you grow closer. I mean, when you're on calls and I feel like there's an environment now where it's okay to be emotional. People cry, people express their emotions, they express how they feel. The work environment has, in that way, I think, become more inclusive and accepting of people and where they are in their lives. And I think flexibility has also been a major theme of the last 10 months, and giving people both that flexibility in terms of where they work and how they work, but also that emotional flexibility with the work they're doing. So because of all of this, I think I have a greater connection, a more meaningful connection with my staff than I ever have before. And again, it's just because we've gone through so much together, and we've had people in our lives get sick. We've had people in our lives pass away. Like, this is heavy stuff. So the whole idea of just like going into work and not expressing emotion and not bringing this with you, like, was talked about maybe 20 or 30 years ago or whatever, I think has been thrown out the window. And I think we need to lean into this new world of being connected and knowing each other and being there for each other. We spend more time with our coworkers probably than anyone else in our lives. So if we can't provide a little bit of emotional support to each other, then I don't think it's working right. Now, with that being said, we have had to amp up the number of meetings because of this virtual setting. I can't walk by someone's desk and be like, hey, how's that project going? So, on a very tactical level, I now, with my direct reports, I have We meet twice a week. We meet once for 15 minutes at the beginning of the week. We meet an hour later on in the week just to make sure that we're continuing to discuss things. This is something that was optional. I presented it to them. I said, do you all want to meet an extra time for just like 15 minutes? And most folks were on board with that. So for the folks who we're doing that, which has been really helpful. I would say team meetings are more regular. We now have a weekly team meeting for my external relations team. It's only a half hour to provide updates. That's in addition to our regular meetings, just for these more sort of casual interactions. And while they're not casual because they're meetings, but they are replacing those walk-bys that you would have at someone's desk or something like that. So my main point is that I think, something's opened up within people in terms of their emotions and how that interacts with work, and that we have to lean into that in order to be successful, because most people can't just leave it all at home. It's going to be with them everywhere they go.
Yeah, and at home and work have certainly been blurred as my children eat in the background of our webinar. Jeremy, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, it's, talk to your people, ask for their ideas too on this as well. And, we just got done with a survey, with one of the, large real estate firms, just saying, okay, what's the expectation moving forward? Coming into the office, how many days were you in before? What's your expectation now? What do we need to be doing to make you feel more part of the office? What equipment do you need, right? Do you need Big Brothers, Big Sisters, tchotchkes to make it feel like your office, those types of things? Do we need to send you a bigger monitor, right? A stipend to get some office type stuff to make it feel like that. And then, engagement, getting their ideas. Like, we already have some canned ideas to think about, but asking, just open-ended, what, happy hours that we're doing virtual, whatever it is, what team building events that you want to participate in, both virtually, and start thinking about what you would be comfortable with in person once things start to open up back up there. So I think that's the key is, and set expectations though, that we're not going to do all of it, but we really want your input because this is, for you and your health, your well-being. And at the end of the day, for the mission, it's so they can be productive as well.
Absolutely. Charles, anything else before we take it visionary for our last question?
I think the one thing that we did is, and we understood that the burden was heavy in March. I don't think anyone is denying the pressure that we were all under, but my team, and it's only 4 of them in the C-suite and myself, we went from meeting once a week on Tuesdays to the first probably 3 months meeting every single day, sometimes throughout the day, because we were very honest and transparent that these are decisions that we're going to make based on the information we have today. And then also not try to get too ahead of ourselves. But in all of that, I started to do a audio or video message to the team every Wednesday. So they would hear from me, they would see me, and we did our regular town halls and we did all of those things. And then it tapered off as we got to the summer, but we kept those things up because I think from a leader's perspective, your people want to see you or hear you, or they want to, I can't stop by a program the way I used to. So that visual or that audio connection, or the simple cell phone video saying, hey, I'm thinking about all of you today. I hope you had a good weekend. We're back on the horse to go through another week. But I think those level of ongoing, honest, direct communication really saved our organization for people feeling connected and not necessarily feeling that they were home alone, in lack of a better term.
What a great idea. Yes, Edward.
Just adding on to something Charles said, and this is kind of unrelated, but something that we discovered throughout this process that has been so helpful is our director of individual giving. When we get donations above a certain level, she sends a thank you video that she creates on her phone, texts it to donors. They love it. Something I highly recommend. It has gone so well for us. She learned about it on another webinar, and I don't know what that is right now, so I apologize for not giving that credit, but it's been huge. People love it. So if you're not doing it, I highly recommend it.
Great ideas there. Video is such an awesome tool. Somebody says they use BombBomb. So check that out.
Yep.
We're going to end here with a super visionary question. And that is, what does a successful nonprofit sector look like in 2030? So, Charles, I'm going to start with you.
I was hoping that you wouldn't. I'm laughing because this is such a good question. But here's my response. I do believe that we will always have people who will need our services and support. But for me, I want to go out of business in 2030. I want to go out of business in 2035. I want to get to the place where policy and regulation and all of the things work in the betterment of people, that the need for Charles and One Hope is lessened only in the cases and the places where it's absolutely needed. So I think if we can move closer to listening to our constituents and servicing them in the ways that they want to be served, we could eventually get to a place where the need for child welfare supports will lessen over time.
Beautifully said. I think all of us want to be out of business by 2030 with that in mind. Jeremy, thoughts on the future of the sector?
Yeah, and I've been working on this too to get, the powers that be to really start viewing. And I do not use the term nonprofit. I mean, we're the only industry that describes ourselves by what we're not. I call us really social profit, because it is society that does profit from the work we do. And it's just a simple request. View the social profit sector like you do any other sector, because we're just as much, I think we're more part of the GDP in this country than manufacturing is. It's incredible. If you view it through that lens, I think you'll see more investments coming that way of real capital. I mean, the jobs that are provided. So just one thing alone, just look at the job creation from the social profit sector. Just one, we compete with GDP. Now think of what happens as a result of our missions. That's not even valued in that. So what part of the GDP really are we when you think about that? And for all of our organizations that leverage volunteers on top of that, right? We're one of the most productive, best investments you could make. We have to start getting to that point where, the powers that be, and that's our job though, to keep doing this, is view us that way. And I'll give you a simple conversation. I was at a round table and I was at one of the big banks. I'm not going to name the bank because I don't want to shame them. And they're investing, in different communities and, small businesses, what have you. I said, and we were all nonprofit leaders, said, do you look at our organizations as a part of that? And the simple answer was, you know what? We don't. So when we look at these economic packages that are going in, we're not even thought of in that space. And I'm like, well, we're actually trying to open up storefronts, hire people in these communities. Why wouldn't we qualify for that? We're creating jobs, and you get the social impact of us being here. So why would we? And they stopped to think, and I could see her, having the person next take notes on that. I'm like, that's what it is starting looking at our sector as a part of these type of packages that come out, because we are hiring people, we are paying rent, and you're getting that added benefit of the service.
What an amazing perspective. I love it. Edward, you're going to close us out.
Wow. So I hope that the idea of gatekeepers goes away by 2030, that community feels like they're a part of the nonprofits that are serving them, and the nonprofits are part of the community in a more meaningful way than ever before. So that's one major part of it. I'll say specifically for HIV, I believe in 2030 that we will end the HIV epidemic in Illinois. We will have the right amount, 20 percentage points more people connected to PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a once daily pill to prevent a HIV negative person from becoming HIV positive sexually. By increasing that and by increasing the number of people connected to care, that we will have 0 new cases of HIV, and everyone will have access to the care they need in Illinois related to HIV. So that is what I hope. And I hope at that point that all the nonprofits working around HIV are working to sustain that and to make it so that we continue to have ended the HIV epidemic from 2030 on. Sorry to make it specific to HIV, but given that this is our goal to end the HIV epidemic by 2030 in Illinois, I thought I had to bring that up.
course, absolutely. Well, thank you for that mission-driven closure, and thanks to all three of you for your time, your wisdom. It has been a pleasure to moderate this conversation. I'm just going to end with a final reminder before we sign off. Check out the Nonprofit Impact Pledge at nonprofitimpactpledge.com. And here's to a brighter future for all. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.